This is Chapter 11, Growth of Western Democracies. Discussion number 1, the United Kingdom's ballot box. Welcome to Great Britain of the mid-1800s. Remember that Great Britain is where much of the United States concepts of constitutional law, limited government, and representation of the people was encapsulated into the United States Constitution. But one of the differences between the United States Constitution and what's going on in Great Britain in the mid-1800s is that we don't exactly have great representation. See, when the United States divided itself and its population to make sure of one man, one vote, at least that was the theoretical idea, Great Britain's lines were drawn 400 years ago. That kind of means that people may have moved and maybe it's not quite represented equally. And Great Britain was having a large difficulty where there were literally areas that had maybe 200 people getting one representative and cities not even being represented at all because the lines of the voting districts had been drawn so far ago. Different populations have moved, different centers of manufacturing, and all of a sudden there were places where people weren't represented. These areas were called rotten boroughs, where they had once been heavily represented, but no longer are. On top of that, Great Britain had some other voting irregularities. First, for example, only if you were a member of the Anglican Church would you be allowed to vote or even hold office. Well, that's kind of, if the whole idea of freedom of religion, I mean, that's why people left Great Britain, but it was still on the books in Great Britain that if you didn't belong to the Church of England, you couldn't be in the government of England. And so Catholics were eliminated from holding office. Jews were allowed from holding office. Uh, any type of Baptist or Mennonite, all those or Quakers could not be a member, could not be a part of the Great Britain government. However, that was eliminated with the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829, which then allowed that anybody could hold any office, that the qualifications would not be based on where you went to church. Also, in 1832, the Reform Act that went through Parliament uh, redrew those lines to make sure it was going to be somewhat of equal representation in the House of Commons. And so that was important, but however, land ownership was still required. Land ownership was not eliminated until much later in British history. Now, for example, we wanted to have universal male suffrage. The group called the Chartists were going around calling for this idea to expand the electorate so that every person could vote and it wouldn't be based on land. They also argued for what was called the Australian ballot, or in another way of saying essentially a secret ballot. See, voting up until this point, the whole town would show up in some building or in some room or even in the town square, and the official vote counter would come and they'd announce your name, and you would shout out who your vote was for. Or say it if you didn't have to shout it, if it was inside a room. And so everyone would know who you were voting for. Well, that was one big difficulty because if you were being pressured by, say, your boss or a neighbor or a government official or the sheriff saying, if you don't vote for me, you will lose your job or you will go to jail or I will come burn your house or, that didn't make for a free electorate, and so the Chartists were pushing for the idea of a secret ballot. And eventually it was put through, especially when we have uh, the leadership of Benjamin Disraeli, who was the leader of the Conservative Party in British politics, and then later on William Gladstone of the Liberal Party. Both of these guys kind of traded back and forth control of the British government in the late 1800s and instituted the ideas of universal male suffrage and the idea of the secret ballot, which ended up expanding the electorate to double the amount of voters before this time period. Concludes discussion number 1, the United Kingdom's ballot box, as part of Chapter 11, the growth of Western democracies.